Pain arrived before consciousness, a brutal rhythmic hammering behind the eyes. Nate dragged himself up from an ocean of expensive linen. The sheets felt like spun glass against his skin, far too soft, far too cold. He blinked against blinding morning sunlight slicing through floor-to-ceiling windows. This wasn't his bed. His mattress possessed a permanent lopsided crater. This mattress felt like a cloud engineered by scientists. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear the whiskey-soaked fog. A sharp glint caught the sunlight. His left hand felt strangely heavy. He stared at his fourth finger. A thick band of brushed platinum rested there. It mocked him with its pristine sheen. Panic flared in his chest, hot and fast. He scrambled out of the bed, his feet hitting icy marble floors. His clothes from yesterday clung to him, wrinkled and smelling of cheap bourbon. "You are awake." The voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Cold, precise, utterly devoid of warmth. Nate whipped around. A woman stood near the doorway, framed in immaculate charcoal tailoring. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe, unforgiving twist. Her eyes held the terrifying calm of a predator assessing a wounded animal. He recognized her instantly. The cover of Forbes, the financial news networks, Kate Sinclair, the Ice Queen of Sinclair Global. "Where am I?" he managed, his throat feeling like sandpaper. Kate walked toward the massive kitchen island. Her heels clicked against the marble in a steady, militant rhythm. She did not look at him with fear. She looked at him with calculation. She slid a crisp, heavily embossed rectangular slip of paper across the dark stone surface. "My penthouse. Your temporary residence for the last 6 hours." She didn't blink. "And this is your exit strategy." Nate approached the island slowly. His head throbbed with every heartbeat. He looked down at the slip of paper. A cashier's check. $500,000. Made out to Nathaniel Wright. The zeros swam in his vision. The amount could clear the medical debt. It could buy the surgery. It could change the entire trajectory of his shattered life. "Sign the non-disclosure agreement on the counter." Her tone remained flat, transactional. "The marriage will be annulled quietly. You take the money, you walk out that door. We never speak of this disastrous lapse in judgment again." Marriage. The word hit him like a physical blow. He looked from the check to the platinum ring on his finger. Fragments of last night flared in the darkness of his memory. Neon lights, the smell of gin. A woman sitting next to him in a shadowed booth, matching him drink for drink, sharing a strange, reckless despair. He remembered signing something, a paper shoved across a sticky bar table by a grinning notary public. He stared at the check. $500,000. He thought of his daughter. He thought of the terrifying wheeze in her chest when she slept. The money was a lifeline. But he looked at Kate Sinclair's face. He saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, the assumption that he could be bought, silenced, and dismissed like a faulty piece of office equipment. He slid the check back across the marble. He pushed the unsigned non-disclosure agreement beside it. "Keep your money." Kate's eyes narrowed a fraction of an inch, a microscopic break in the ice. "Don't be a fool. You are unemployed. You are broke. Take the compensation." Nate stood taller. He squared his shoulders, letting the hangover fade behind a wall of pure, unadulterated reserve. "I have dignity. I deserve respect. Dignity does not pay hospital bills. No, but it buys the right to look my daughter in the eye." He pulled the platinum ring off his finger. It fought him for a second, catching on the knuckle before sliding free. He placed it carefully on top of the $500,000 check. "I don't sell my self-worth to cover a bar tab mistake." He turned his back on the billionaire. He walked toward the heavy oak door at the end of the foyer. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. The silence in the penthouse stretched tight, vibrating with an energy Kate Sinclair had likely never encountered. Someone had just walked away from her money. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The elevator ride down felt like descending from orbit. The cold air of the New York morning hit him the moment he stepped onto the pavement. The city roared to life around him. Taxis blurred past, sirens wailed in the distance. Nate pulled his coat tight against the chill. He needed to get home. He needed to see Mia. Every step toward the subway station felt heavier than the last. The adrenaline of rejecting the money began to fade, replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. Yesterday had been the worst day of his life. The memory played in his mind, vivid and bitter. Sitting in the sterile, aggressively fluorescent sub-basement of Sinclair Global's data division, he had been tracking a specific elusive anomaly in the Q3 projections. The numbers weren't just wrong, they were manipulated, cleverly routed through a labyrinth of shell accounts, $2 million bleeding slowly from the corporate charity fund. He had compiled the data, he had built the predictive models, he had taken it directly to the chief financial officer, Bradley Lawson. Bradley's office had smelled of expensive leather and arrogance. The CFO had barely glanced at the tablet Nate placed on his mahogany desk. Bradley had simply smiled, a thin, bloodless smile that belonged to a shark. "You are a maintenance analyst, Mr. Wright. You fix server cooling systems. You do not audit executive accounts. The data is clear. The charity fund is being drained." Nate had stood his ground. Intent doesn't erase impact. Someone is stealing from sick children. Bradley had stood up. He smoothed his immaculately tailored suit. He looked at Nate not as a man, but as a minor inconvenience to be swatted away. "You are confused, and you are fired. Security will escort you out. Leave the building immediately." The walk of shame out of the glass tower had burned, the security guards hovering, the whispers of colleagues. But the real devastation had come 2 hours later, standing at the pharmacy counter, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The pharmacist, a kind older woman named Mrs. Higgins, pushing the small white paper bag across the counter. "That will be $480, Nate." He had swiped his card. The machine beeped, a harsh electronic rejection, insufficient funds. He swiped again. Same beep. The color drained from his face. Mrs. Higgins looked away, her eyes full of a pity he couldn't stomach. "I can't let you take it without payment, Nate. I'm sorry, corporate policy." He had walked out of the pharmacy empty-handed. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. His 6-year-old daughter needed those pills to keep her heart beating in a regular rhythm. And he had failed her. The sheer weight of that failure had driven him into the neon-lit dive bar 3 blocks from his apartment. He had ordered the cheapest whiskey. He had wanted to erase his own mind. And then she had sat down next to him. Kate Sinclair, wearing a trench coat over evening wear, looking as lost and furious as he felt. They hadn't exchanged names, only grievances against a world that felt rigged. Now, emerging from the subway into his own neighborhood, the grime of the city felt familiar. The cracked sidewalks, the overflowing trash cans, the smell of stale coffee and exhaust fumes. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment. The wood creaked under his weight. He unlocked the door quietly. The apartment was tiny, a single room divided by a faded curtain. The paint peeled in the corners. The radiator hissed a weak, erratic rhythm. But it was clean, spotlessly clean, every surface scrubbed, every book aligned. He refused to let his daughter live in squalor, even if they lived in poverty. He stepped past the curtain. Mia was asleep on her small bed, her dark curls spilled across the pillow, her chest rose and fell. He watched closely. The breathing was shallow. A slight wheeze caught in her throat on the exhale. The sound terrified him. It was the sound of a ticking clock he didn't know how to stop. He knelt beside the bed. He reached out, his large calloused hand gently brushing the curls from her forehead. She stirred, her eyes fluttered open, big dark eyes that saw far too much for a child her age. "Daddy?" Her voice was a soft rasp. "I'm here, baby. You didn't come home last night. Mrs. Gable stayed with me." Guilt twisted a knife in his gut. "I know. I had to work late, trying to fix a big problem." Mia sat up slowly. She rubbed her eyes. She reached for the small stack of crayons and paper on her nightstand. She always drew when she was worried. Did you fix it? Not yet, but I will. She looked at him critically. You look tired, Daddy. Are you fighting bad guys? He forced a smile, a real one, reserved only for her. Something like that. How is your chest feeling? It feels like a tight hug, but not a good hug, a heavy one. The description broke his heart. It was clinically precise for a 6-year-old. She had lived with the congenital heart defect long enough to know the exact vocabulary of her own fragility. He pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. He breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered on the apartment door. Nate tensed. He gently pulled away from Mia. Stay here, sweetie. Keep drawing. He walked to the door, his muscles coiled. It could be the landlord. He was 3 weeks behind on rent. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Kate Sinclair stood in the hallway. She looked entirely out of place. Her designer coat contrasted sharply with the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet of the corridor. 2 massive men in dark suits stood a discreet distance behind her, scanning the stairwell. Her eyes locked onto his. The ice was still there, but underneath it a frantic energy vibrated. You left the ring, she stated. I left the money, Nate countered. What are you doing here? We need to talk, inside. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past him, stepping into the cramped living space. Her eyes swept the room. She took in the worn couch, the second-hand television, the meticulously organized stacks of medical bills on the small dining table. She didn't look disgusted. She looked analytical, processing variables. Mia peeked around the curtain. She held a purple crayon in one hand. She stared at the strange woman invading their home. Kate stopped. She looked at the little girl. The sharp lines of the CEO's face softened for a microscopic fraction of a second. The executive armor cracked, just a hairline fracture before sealing shut again. This is your daughter. Her name is Mia, and this isn't a museum. Say what you came to say. Kate turned her attention back to Nate. The frantic energy in her eyes sharpened into pure, calculated strategy. Bradley Lawson is attempting a hostile takeover of my company. He is convening the board on Monday to challenge my leadership. He claims I am erratic, unstable, incapable of projecting the family-oriented stability the major shareholders demand. Nate crossed his arms. Sounds like a billionaire problem. I'm a maintenance analyst you fired. You were fired by Bradley, without my authorization. Kate stepped closer. The scent of her expensive perfume clashed with the smell of the old radiator. Last night, in that bar, we got legally married. I thought it was a disaster. Now I realize it is a tactical advantage. Nate stared at her, disbelief warring with anger. You want to use me as a prop. I want to use our legal status to neutralize Bradley's primary argument against me. A sudden secret wedding to a hard-working, devoted single father. It reframes my image entirely. It makes me human to the board. It buys me the time I need to expose his underlying financial sabotage. I already found the sabotage. He's draining the charity fund. Kate's eyes widened slightly. You found the Cayman routing. I built a predictive algorithm that flagged the anomalies 3 weeks ago. He fired me to bury it. The silence in the small room shifted. The dynamic altered. Kate wasn't just looking at a convenient prop anymore. She was looking at a weapon. A highly competent, deeply wronged weapon. A contract, Kate said, her voice dropping lower, losing the boardroom projection. 1 year, you move into the penthouse. We present a united front to the public and the board. In exchange, I reinstate your employment, and I cover every single medical expense for your daughter. The surgery, the medication, the specialists, everything. The offer hung in the dusty air. It was the exact thing he had prayed for in the hospital waiting room. It was the answer to every terrifying night listening to Mia struggle to breathe. It was salvation, but it came wrapped in a lie, and it came as charity. Nate looked at the stacks of bills. He looked at Mia, who was currently drawing a picture of a giant purple dragon. He looked back at Kate Sinclair. No handouts. Kate frowned. I am offering to save your daughter's life, and I will save it, but not by taking your charity. Nate stepped forward, closing the distance, forcing her to look up at him. I will sign your contract. I will play the part, but I demand a real job. Vice President of Data Analytics. I have the skills. You know I do. I will work for you. And I will pay 20% of my daughter's medical bills from my own salary. 20% is arbitrary. I can easily cover the total. It's not arbitrary. It's my self-respect. Nate's voice was low, vibrating with absolute conviction. I don't sell my dignity. And I won't let my daughter think her life was bought by a stranger. I earn her survival. Kate studied him, really studied him. For years she had been surrounded by men who wanted to take her money, steal her power, or diminish her presence. Here was a man demanding the right to work for his own salvation, refusing a free ride out of hell. Vice President of Data Analytics, Kate repeated. You will report directly to me. Your salary will be commensurate with the title. You will pay your 20%. And you don't interfere with how I raise my daughter. Agreed. Then we have a deal. Kate reached into her designer bag. She pulled out the brushed platinum ring. She held it out to him, then put it back on. Nate took the ring. The metal was cold. He slid it onto his finger. It felt heavier this time, a shackle and a shield all at once. Mia walked out from behind the curtain. She walked straight up to Kate. She held out the piece of paper. I drew this for you. Kate looked down at the paper. It was a drawing of a woman in a gray suit standing next to a large purple dragon. The woman in the drawing had a straight, flat line for a mouth. Thank you, Kate said awkwardly, taking the paper. My dad says you're a good person, Mia said, looking up with dark, honest eyes. He says you just forgot how to smile. The dragon is going to teach you. Kate froze. She looked from the drawing to the little girl and then to Nate. A profound, unsettling vulnerability flashed across the Ice Queen's face. The armor didn't just crack, a piece of it chipped away entirely. She didn't know how to respond to unconditional observation. We leave in 2 hours, Kate said abruptly, retreating into logistics. My security team will handle the packing. Bring only what matters. She turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking rapidly down the worn hallway, fleeing the quiet intimacy of the small apartment. Nate watched her go. He looked down at Mia. We're going on an adventure, sweetie. To the Dragon's Cave? Something like that. 2 hours later, a sleek black SUV carried them away from the only home Mia had ever known. Nate sat in the spacious leather interior, watching the grim landscape of his neighborhood fade into the glittering canyons of Manhattan. The transition was jarring. He felt like an astronaut being launched into a hostile, alien environment without a suit. They arrived at the penthouse, the same pristine marble-floored fortress Nate had fled that morning. But now it wasn't a crime scene of a drunken mistake. It was a battlefield. Mia ran to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her small hands against the glass, staring down at the city lights far below. We live in the sky now, Daddy. For a little while, Nate said gently. Kate emerged from her home office. She had changed into a softer, less structured outfit, though the tension in her shoulders remained rigid. Her room is down the hall, second door on the left. I had my assistant stock it with necessities. Nate guided Mia down the wide hallway. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was massive. Soft violet walls, a bed that looked like a marshmallow, shelves filled with pristine, untouched toys and art supplies. It was a catalog image of a child's bedroom, devoid of any actual soul. Mia walked in slowly. She touched a large, perfectly clean stuffed bear. She didn't hug it. She just poked it. It's very clean. You can mess it up, Nate promised. He unpacked her worn, faded purple blanket from his duffel bag and draped it over the end of the immaculate bed. He set her small wooden box of crayons on the sleek, modern desk. Instantly, the room felt a fraction warmer. He left Mia to explore and walked back to the living area. Kate was standing by the kitchen island, staring at a tablet, her brow furrowed. "Bradley just sent a company-wide email," Kate said without looking up. "He is restructuring the IT and data departments, consolidating power before the Monday board meeting. He is trying to lock me out of the financial archives." Nate walked over. He didn't ask for permission. He looked over her shoulder at the tablet screen. He read the technical jargon, translating the corporate speak into operational reality. "He's moving the primary servers to a segregated cloud architecture," Nate diagnosed instantly. "If he completes the migration, he controls all access logs. He can scrub the charity fund transfers permanently." Kate finally looked at him. "Can you stop it?" "I don't need to stop it. I just need to mirror the data before the migration completes." Nate looked around. "I need a terminal, high processing power, direct hardline connection to the Sinclair mainframe." "My home office." Kate gestured toward the double doors. "It has a direct secure tunnel to the headquarters." Nate walked into the office. It was austere, functional, dominated by a massive curved monitor. He sat down in the leather executive chair. He cracked his knuckles. This was his territory. He might be out of his depth in penthouse suites and contract marriages, but behind a keyboard he was a god. He brought up the command prompt. His fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion. Lines of green code cascaded down the black screen. He was bypassing the standard security protocols, exploiting a vulnerability he had noticed 3 months ago but hadn't been authorized to patch. Kate stood in the doorway watching him. She watched the intense focus settle over his features. The rigid posture of the maintenance man vanished, replaced by the apex predator of the digital realm. He wasn't just competent, he was extraordinary. He instituted a rolling cipher on the archival data, Nate muttered, his eyes darting across the scrolling numbers. Smart, but sloppy. He used the default seed generation. English, Nate. He locked the door but left the key under the mat. Nate hit the enter key with a sharp crack. "I'm in." The screen split. On the left, a massive progress bar appeared, showing Bradley's server migration at 60%. On the right, Nate initiated a shadow copy protocol, siphoning the raw, unencrypted financial logs directly into a secure partition on Kate's local drive. "We are racing him," Nate said. His heart rate elevated, the thrill of the digital chase pushing back the fatigue. "If he hits 100% before my copy finishes, we lose the proof." The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. The only sound in the office was the rapid clicking of the mechanical keyboard and the soft hum of the massive processor cooling fans. Migration, 75%. Copy, 68%. "He's accelerating the bandwidth allocation," Nate noted, his jaw tight. "He knows someone is in the system." "Can he trace it here?" Kate asked, stepping closer to the desk. "I bounced the connection through 3 proxy servers in Frankfurt. To him, it looks like an aggressive botnet attack. He's trying to outrun it." Migration, 88%. Copy, 85%. Nate leaned forward, his face bathed in the blue light of the monitor. Come on. He executed a secondary script, forcefully throttling the mainframe's outgoing bandwidth, starving Bradley's migration process of resources. Migration, 92%. Copy, 94%. The progress bars crawled. Every percentage point felt like an hour. Nate's hands hovered over the keyboard, ready to execute an emergency kill switch if Bradley initiated a total system purge. Migration, 98%. Copy, 99%. Got it! Nate slammed the enter key. The right side of the screen flashed green. Transfer complete. A microsecond later, the left side of the screen went black. Connection terminated. Nate exhaled a long, shaky breath. He leaned back in the chair. He tapped the screen. "You now possess the raw, unaltered financial logs for the last 5 years, including the exact routing numbers Bradley used to siphon the charity funds to his offshore accounts." Kate stared at the green confirmation message. The proof, the weapon she needed to survive the board meeting. She looked from the screen to the man sitting in her chair. the man she had tried to pay off and discard 12 hours ago. "You did it," she whispered. The ice in her voice was completely gone, replaced by genuine shock. "I did my job," Nate corrected calmly. He stood up from the desk. "I am Vice President of Data Analytics. This is what you pay me for." He walked past her, heading back toward the living room to check on Mia. He didn't ask for praise, he didn't gloat, he had simply executed his duty with terrifying efficiency. Kate watched him walk away. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She had brought him here as a shield. She was beginning to realize he was a sword. The first night in the penthouse felt like sleeping inside a museum. Nate lay in the guest suite, staring at a ceiling painted a pristine, featureless white. The silence was oppressive. No sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just the hum of climate control. He checked his phone. Tuesday, 2:14 a.m. He couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from the data heist had faded, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. He slipped out of bed, pulling on a faded gray t-shirt and sweatpants. He walked silently down the wide hallway to check on Mia. He cracked her door open. The nightlight cast a soft purple glow over the room. She was breathing evenly. The wheeze was still there, but it hadn't worsened. He watched her for a long minute, grounding himself in the reality of her survival. She was the center of his universe. Everything else, the penthouse, the billionaire CEO, the hostile takeover, was just orbital debris. He closed the door softly and moved toward the massive kitchen. He needed water. As he turned the corner into the main living space, he froze. Kate Sinclair was sitting on the floor by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a silk robe over her pajamas. Her knees were pulled up to her chest. She held a glass of dark liquid in one hand. She was staring out at the sprawling, glittering grid of the city, looking entirely isolated. She didn't look like the Ice Queen. She looked like a woman who had built a fortress and suddenly realized she had locked herself inside alone. Nate stepped into the soft light spilling from the city. "Can't sleep?" Kate flinched slightly, startled. She quickly wiped a hand across her cheek, turning her face away to hide the motion. She tightened her grip on the glass. "I was reviewing the board agenda for Monday." "You don't review agendas in the dark, sitting on the floor." Nate walked over to the kitchen island. He poured a glass of water from the tap. He walked over and sat down on the floor a few feet away from her. Not too close, respecting the boundary. She looked at him, her defenses snapping back into place. "What are you doing?" "Drinking water." He took a sip. "And sitting. It's a free floor." They sat in silence for a long time. The city blinked below them, millions of lives playing out in tiny illuminated squares. Nate didn't push. He understood the need for silent companionship. He had spent months sitting exactly like this after his wife died, staring at the walls of their apartment, unable to process the void. "He was my fiancé." The words cut through the silence, sharp and unexpected. Kate didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant skyline. "Bradley," Nate guessed softly. 5 years ago." Kate took a slow sip of her drink. "We were building the company together. I thought we were building a life. He told me I was too focused on the data, too cold. He said I needed to let him handle the human element, the networking, the board relations. I trusted him." She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "He used that trust to build his own faction within my company. He manipulated the board. He poisoned my relationships with the key shareholders. He convinced them I was a brilliant machine, but a terrible leader. When I realized what he was doing, I broke the engagement, but he had already embedded himself like a tick. I couldn't fire him without triggering a shareholder revolt." Nate listened. He heard the betrayal echoing in her precise, measured words. The profound violation of trust. "You built armor," Nate said quietly. "You decided if they thought you were a machine, you would be a machine." Kate finally turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were dark, reflecting the city lights. "A machine cannot be betrayed. A machine does not feel the knife in its back. It simply recalculates and continues operations. But you aren't a machine, Kate. If I am not, they will tear me apart on Monday. Bradley will use my lack of emotional connection against me. He will present himself as the stable, relatable alternative. He will take my company, and he will dismantle everything I built. Nate set his water glass down on the hardwood floor. He looked at her not as an employer, not as a billionaire, but as a person backed into a corner by someone she had once loved. A cornered man fights, Nate said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of his own brutal survival. A broken man begs, I only know how to fight, and from what I saw today, so do you. Fighting requires weapons. I have data now, thanks to you. But data does not change the narrative. They want a human being. They want family values. They want warmth. Then we give them warmth. Nate shifted his posture, leaning slightly forward. We don't pretend. We build something functional. You want to beat him? You don't outcalculate him. You outlive him. Kate frowned, confused. What does that mean? It means starting tomorrow, you don't just exist in this penthouse. You live in it. You eat breakfast with us. You talk to Mia. You learn how to exist outside the boardroom. If you want the board to believe you have a family, you have to actually participate in one. Panic flared briefly in her eyes. The idea of forced domesticity terrified her more than a hostile takeover. I don't know how to talk to children. I don't know how to be a mother figure. You don't have to be her mother. Her mother is gone. Her mother was named Sarah, and she was the bravest person I ever knew. Nate's voice grew thick for a moment before he steadied it. You just have to be Kate. You just have to be present. Kate looked away, staring back out at the city. The silence stretched again, but the texture of it had changed. It wasn't isolated anymore, it was shared. Breakfast is at 7, Nate stated, standing up from the floor. Don't be late. He walked back toward the hallway. He didn't wait for her to agree. He knew she would be there. The Ice Queen was terrified of melting, but she was more terrified of losing. Wednesday morning arrived with the smell of burning toast. Nate stood in the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen, fighting with a toaster that possessed more processing power than his first car. He managed to eject the bread just before it caught fire, scraping the charred edges into the stainless steel sink. Mia sat at the massive marble island, her legs swinging. She was drawing again, a blue dragon this time. Promptly at 7 a.m., the soft click of heels echoed in the hallway. Kate appeared. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, perfectly pressed, her hair secured in its usual severe style. She looked ready for a war tribunal, not breakfast. She walked to the island and stood awkwardly, unsure of where to place herself. Sit, Nate instructed, placing a plate of slightly scraped toast and scrambled eggs in front of one of the bar stools. Kate sat down stiffly. She looked at the eggs as if they might be poisoned. I usually just have coffee. Coffee is a stimulant, not a meal. Eat. Nate poured a glass of orange juice and set it beside her plate. He placed a small plastic cup of milk in front of Mia, along with her morning array of pills. 3 pills, 1 white, 1 blue, 1 tiny half pill that Nate had carefully cut with a razor blade. Kate watched the ritual. She watched the casual, practiced way Nate guided his daughter through the medication. There was no pity in his motion, only steady, reliable care. Are those for your heart? Kate asked suddenly. The question was blunt, lacking tact. Nate paused, a flash of defensiveness tightening his jaw. But Mia answered before he could. Yes, they make the heavy hug go away. Mia swallowed the pills expertly with a gulp of milk. She looked at Kate. Do you take pills for your heart? Kate blinked, thrown completely off balance. No, my heart is mechanically sound. My dad says sometimes people's hearts hurt because they are lonely, not because they are broken. Mia took a bite of toast. Are you lonely? The kitchen went dead silent. Nate froze, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth. He looked at Kate, expecting her to shut down, to retreat behind the corporate firewall. Kate stared at the 6-year-old. The pure, unvarnished honesty of the child sliced straight through decades of carefully constructed defenses. She looked at Nate, then back to Mia. "Yes," Kate said softly. The word cost her immensely. "I think I am very lonely." Mia nodded sagely, accepting the vulnerability as a simple fact. She slid her drawing across the marble island. "This is a blue dragon. Blue dragons are good at guarding castles. You can keep him, so you don't have to guard the castle all by yourself." Kate looked down at the drawing, the crude, waxy lines of crayon, the genuine offer of protection from a fragile child facing her own mortality. Her throat tightened. She reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the paper toward her. "Thank you, Mia. I will keep him very safe." Nate watched the exchange. He saw the genuine emotion flicker in Kate's eyes before she quickly took a bite of her eggs to hide it. The armor was cracking. The connection was forming. It was terrifyingly fast, built on mutual desperation, but it was real. "Eat your eggs, Kate," Nate said gently. "We have a lot of work to do." The rest of the week became a bizarre, high-stakes boot camp. By day, Nate occupied the VP office at Sinclair Global. He was a phantom in the corporate machine, pulling data, cross-referencing files, building an airtight, undeniable case against Bradley Lawson. He ignored the whispers in the break room. He ignored the hostile stares from Bradley's loyalists. He kept his head down and his code clean. By night, the penthouse transformed into a strange domestic laboratory. Nate forced Kate to participate in the mundane rituals of life. He made her help chop vegetables for dinner, watching with quiet amusement as the billionaire struggled to dice an onion with a $10,000 chef's knife. He made her sit on the couch while Mia watched cartoons, refusing to let her hide in the home office. Thursday evening, the crisis accelerated. Nate was sitting at the dining table reviewing printed spreadsheets. Kate was pacing the living room on the phone with her lead corporate counsel. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. "I don't care about the optics, David. Block the injunction. If Bradley freezes the board votes before Monday, we lose our leverage. File the counter motion now." She hung up, throwing the phone onto the couch. She rubbed her temples. "He's accelerating the timeline," Kate announced, looking at Nate. "He knows we have the data. He is trying to force an emergency vote tomorrow afternoon instead of Monday. He claims my sudden marriage has destabilized the stock price." "Has it?" Nate asked, flipping a page. "A minor dip, 2%. It's a pretext. He wants to execute the coup before I can present the embezzlement proof." "Then we present it tomorrow." Nate didn't look up. "The data is ready. The routing numbers are verified. I traced the shell accounts back to a holding company registered in his sister's name in Delaware. It's bulletproof." "You don't understand." Kate walked over to the table, her hands flat on the polished wood. "He controls the scheduling committee. He will not allow me the floor to present evidence. He will call for a vote of no confidence the moment the meeting begins. He has the majority whipped." Nate stopped reading. He looked up at her. The panic was back in her eyes. The cold, calculating CEO was losing ground to the terrified woman underneath. "Then we don't present it to the board," Nate said slowly, a dangerous idea forming in his mind. "We present it to the witnesses." "What witnesses?" "The shareholders, the press, the employees." Nate stood up. "If he locks the door to the boardroom, we blow the walls down. You are the CEO, Kate. You have the authority to call a company-wide town hall, broadcast it live, internal network and external press feed." Kate stared at him, horrified. "A public execution. The stock will plummet. The scandal will take years to clean up." "A cornered man fights," Nate reminded her softly. "He is trying to suffocate you in a closed room. You drag him into the light. You show the world the truth. Truth defeats performance, every time." Before Kate could argue, a sharp, terrifying sound ripped through the quiet penthouse. It wasn't an alarm. It was a gasp, a wet, desperate, choking sound from the hallway. Nate's blood ran cold. He dropped the spreadsheets. He sprinted past Kate, his bare feet sliding on the marble floor. He rounded the corner into the hallway. Mia was on the floor outside her bedroom door. She was curled into a tight ball. Her hands were clutching her chest. Her face was a terrifying shade of pale gray, her lips tinged with blue. She was fighting for air, taking rapid, shallow, useless breaths. "Mia!" Nate hit the floor, sliding to his knees beside her. He scooped her up, supporting her head. Her skin was clammy, her eyes were wide, filled with absolute terror. "Look at me, baby, look at Daddy. Breathe with me. Slow, slow." He tried to project calm, but his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The wheeze in her chest had transformed into a harsh, rattling scrape. Kate ran into the hallway, stopping dead at the sight of the little girl fighting for her life. Her hands flew to her mouth. The corporate crisis vanished. The hostile takeover evaporated. All that mattered was the child gasping on the floor. "Call an ambulance!" Nate roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Now, Kate! Now!" Kate didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate. She sprinted for the wall panel, slamming the emergency medical dispatch button connected directly to the building's private concierge. "Pediatric cardiac emergency, penthouse. Get the paramedics up here now. Clear the service elevator." Her voice was pure command, cutting through the panic. She dropped to her knees beside Nate. She didn't know what to do, but she refused to step back. She reached out, her trembling hand grasping Mia's small, cold fingers. "You hold on, Mia," Kate commanded, her voice fierce, thick with an emotion she had buried for years. "You hear me? You are a dragon. You hold on." Mia's eyes fluttered, rolling back slightly. The rattling in her chest grew weaker. She was fading. The heavy hug was crushing her. "No, no, no," Nate chanted, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, searching for the pulse. It was there, but it was erratic, terrifyingly fast and weak. "Stay with me, baby, please, stay with me." The next 10 minutes dissolved into a blur of agonizing chaos. The heavy boots of paramedics echoing in the foyer, the harsh bark of medical terminology, oxygen masks. IV lines initiated on the living room floor. Nate was shoved back as the professionals took over, his hands empty, covered in cold sweat. He watched them lift his daughter onto the stretcher. He felt a hand grip his arm, a tight, unyielding grip. It was Kate. Her face was as pale as his, her eyes wide with shared terror. "We are going with her," Kate stated. She didn't wait for permission. She pulled him toward the door, following the paramedics. The ride in the back of the ambulance was a nightmare of flashing lights and screaming sirens. Nate held Mia's hand, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since his wife died. Kate sat on the opposite bench, completely silent, her eyes locked on the heart monitor's erratic green line. They burst through the double doors of the emergency room. A swarm of doctors descended. The stretcher was rushed into a trauma bay. "You must wait here," a nurse stated firmly, blocking Nate's path. "The cardiology team is working on her." "I can't leave her," Nate pleaded, his voice breaking. "I have to be there." "Let them work, Nate." Kate's hands found his shoulders. She pulled him back, her grip surprisingly strong. "Let them save her." He collapsed into a hard, plastic waiting room chair. He buried his face in his hands. He couldn't breathe. The air in the hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear, the exact smell of the day his wife had died. He was drowning in it. Kate stood over him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say everything would be fine. She understood the insult of false hope. Instead, she sat down next to him. She reached out and wrapped her arms around him, pulling his rigid, trembling frame against her. She held him. The Ice Queen, who avoided human contact like a plague, anchored him in the middle of a crowded emergency room. Time ceased to exist. Minutes dragged into hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed a mocking rhythm overhead. Nate stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his mind looping the image of Mia gasping on the hallway floor. He had failed to protect her. He had brought her into a war zone of corporate greed, distracting himself with data and servers while her small heart gave out. The guilt was absolute. Finally, the trauma bay doors opened. A doctor in blue scrubs walked toward them. His face was unreadable. Nate stood up, his legs feeling like lead. Kate stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "Mr. Wright?" the doctor asked. "Is she alive?" Nate demanded, bypassing every pleasantry. "She is alive. She has been stabilized." The doctor sighed, pulling off his surgical cap. She suffered an acute exacerbation of her ventricular defect. The heart muscle was straining too hard, causing sudden fluid buildup in the lungs. Nate closed his eyes, a massive shudder of relief rocking his body. Alive. She was alive. However, the doctor continued, his tone turning grave, her condition has degraded significantly. The timeline we initially projected is no longer viable. The defect is expanding. She requires the corrective surgery immediately. How immediately? Kate asked, stepping forward, assuming command. Within 48 hours, the doctor stated bluntly. If she leaves this hospital without the surgical intervention, the next episode will be fatal. We have placed her on the transplant surgical priority list, but the procedure is highly complex. Do it, Nate said. Whatever it takes. Do the surgery. The doctor hesitated. He looked at a clipboard in his hand. Mr. Wright, there is a complication. We ran your insurance information through the hospital database to authorize the emergency procedure. Nate's stomach dropped. And? Your policy with Sinclair Global was flagged. The benefits were retroactively terminated 3 hours ago. The system shows your employment status was officially listed as terminated with cause prior to your current enrollment, triggering a fraud hold on all dependents. Nate stared at the doctor. The words didn't make sense. I am the vice president of data analytics. I am married to the CEO. I understand, the doctor said apologetically. But our financial department cannot authorize $1 million pediatric open-heart surgery with a red-flagged insurance profile. We need clearance from your corporate HR director or a direct deposit of the estimated funds to proceed. Nate slowly turned his head. He looked at Kate. Kate's face was a mask of absolute terrifying fury. It wasn't directed at the doctor. It was directed at the invisible enemy who had just crossed the line from corporate sabotage to attempted murder. Bradley, Kate whispered. The name tasted like poison. He accessed the HR mainframe. He altered the employment timeline to trigger the fraud protocol. He is trying to force you to resign by holding your daughter hostage. Nate felt a cold, hard knot form in the center of his chest. The panic vanished, replaced by a crystalline, blinding rage. Bradley Lawson had just weaponized his child's life. I have dignity, Nate said softly, the words vibrating with a lethal intensity. I deserve respect, and he will learn exactly what happens when you threaten my blood. He looked at the doctor. Keep her stable. Prepare the operating room. The hold will be cleared by tomorrow morning. Mr. Wright, without authorization, I said prepare the room. Nate's voice brokered no argument. He turned to Kate. The Ice Queen was gone. The woman standing beside him was a warrior, her eyes blazing with shared fury. We are not waiting for Monday, Nate stated. We are not waiting for a town hall. We are going to the Sinclair Tower right now, tonight. Kate nodded slowly. The calculation in her eyes was cold and absolute. He wanted a war. We will give him a slaughter. They left the emergency room. They walked out into the cold, dark New York night. The battle lines were drawn. The stakes were no longer a company, a title, or a bank account. The stakes were a 6-year-old girl's heartbeat. And Nate Wright was prepared to burn the entire corporate empire to the ground to keep that heart beating. The black SUV tore through the desolate, rain-slicked streets of Lower Manhattan. The city was a ghost town at 3 in the morning, a labyrinth of concrete and glass illuminated by the harsh sodium vapor glare of street lamps. Nate stared out the tinted window. The reflection of the city slid across the glass, overlaying his own exhausted features. His hands rested on his knees, balled into tight, unyielding fists. The adrenaline from the emergency room had not faded. It had calcified into a cold, dense block of pure tactical focus. He was no longer a grieving widower or a desperate father begging for a lifeline. He was a man walking into a war zone, and he intended to burn the enemy camp to ash. Kate sat beside him in the cavernous back seat. She was a statue of contained fury. She had spent the last 20 minutes rapid-firing encrypted text messages to her core security personnel, entirely bypassing the standard corporate hierarchy. She wasn't acting like a CEO preparing for a civilized board meeting. She was acting like a general orchestrating a midnight raid. The soft glow of the smartphone screen illuminated the sharp, unforgiving angles of her face. The armor had returned, but it was forged differently now. It wasn't built to keep the world out. It was built to protect the fragile life currently hooked up to machines miles away. The vehicle swerved sharply, pulling into the subterranean loading dock of the Sinclair Global Tower. The massive steel roll-up doors groaned upward, swallowing the SUV into the concrete belly of the skyscraper. The tires screeched against the polished epoxy floor, coming to a violent halt inches from the private executive elevator bank. The heavy doors unlocked with a sharp mechanical thud. Nate stepped out into the frigid air of the parking garage. The silence of the massive building pressed down on them, heavy with the weight of billions of dollars and decades of corporate ruthlessness. Kate swiped a black, unmarked biometric card across the scanner panel. The elevator doors slid open in absolute silence. They stepped inside the brushed steel cage. She pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The human resources server farm. The ascent was a high-speed vacuum. Nate felt the pressure shift in his ears. He watched the floor numbers blur on the digital display. The insurance database is isolated from the primary financial grid, Kate stated, her eyes fixed straight ahead. It requires a physical terminal override to reverse a fraud protocol block. If Bradley manipulated the timestamp on your termination file, the override has to originate from the root directory. I know the architecture, Nate replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I patched the cooling systems on that floor 3 months ago. The root directory is secured behind a dual authentication biometric firewall. You have master access. I do. But Bradley is the chief financial officer. He has secondary master access. If he initiated a hostile lockout, my credentials alone might not be enough to break the encryption before morning. Then I will break the encryption. The doors glided open. The 42nd floor was a vast, freezing expanse of blinking server racks and raised anti-static flooring. The air hummed with the aggressive roar of industrial cooling units. The corridor was bathed in an eerie, synthetic blue light cast by thousands of LED indicators. It felt like walking inside the mechanical brain of a leviathan. They moved swiftly down the central aisle. Nate navigated the labyrinth of hardware with practiced precision. He knew every cable tray, every ventilation shaft. He led them to a reinforced glass enclosure at the far end of the room. The HR mainframe. Kate stepped up to the terminal outside the glass. She placed her palm flat against the glowing biometric scanner and leaned in for the retinal sweep. A green laser dragged horizontally across her eye. The system chirped. A harsh, digitized voice echoed in the empty room. Access denied. Fraud protocol alpha engaged. Administrator override required. Kate slammed her fist against the steel console. The impact echoed sharply over the hum of the servers. She tried again. Palm flat. Retinal scan. Access denied. He changed the root permissions, Kate hissed, her breath pluming faintly in the freezing air. He elevated his own administrative clearance above mine. That requires board approval. He couldn't have done that legally. He didn't do it legally. The voice drifted out from the shadows behind them, smooth, cultured, dripping with absolute arrogance. Nate turned slowly. Kate went rigid. Bradley Lawson stepped out from behind a massive row of backup generators. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, looking entirely out of place in the freezing, utilitarian environment of the server farm. He checked a gold watch on his wrist, a thin, patronizing smile playing across his lips. 3:40 in the morning. Bradley noted, his footsteps echoing on the anti-static tiles. I assumed it would take you at least until sunrise to realize you were entirely locked out of the castle. You are slightly faster than I calculated, Kate, though I suppose desperation is a powerful accelerant. Nate stepped in front of Kate, placing himself directly between the CEO and the man holding his daughter's life hostage. He didn't shout, he didn't lunge. The sheer suffocating gravity of his presence forced Bradley to stop his advance. Unlock the insurance policy. Nate's voice was a flat, dead calm that promised unspeakable violence. Bradley looked at Nate, his smile widening into a sneer of pure classist contempt. He looked the maintenance analyst up and down, taking in the faded t-shirt and the exhaustion lining his face. Or what, Mr. Wright? You will fix a broken air conditioner at me? Bradley chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. You seem to labor under the delusion that you are a participant in this game. You are not. You are a pawn that Kate foolishly dragged onto the board, and I have simply removed you. You flagged a dying child's medical coverage. Kate stepped out from behind Nate, her voice vibrating with a rage so cold it rivaled the temperature of the room. You crossed a line that you cannot uncross, Bradley. The board will tear you apart for this. The board will never know. Bradley reached into the breast pocket of his suit. He pulled out a sleek silver smartphone and tapped the screen. He turned it around, holding it up for them to see. It was a draft of an article from a notorious high-circulation financial tabloid. The headline screamed in bold black letters over a photograph of Kate and Nate walking into the penthouse lobby. Ice Queen's $1 million charity case. CEO fakes marriage to desperate janitor to save job. It goes live at 6 in the morning, Bradley announced, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. The article details the exact timeline of your sudden, miraculous nuptials. It highlights Mr. Wright's pathetic financial insolvency. It features an anonymous HR source detailing how you bypassed standard vetting protocols to instantly elevate a terminated maintenance worker to vice president. Bradley lowered the phone. The smirk hardened into a glare of absolute triumph. By the time the market opens, Sinclair Global stock will be in free fall. The shareholders will demand blood. The emergency session is already scheduled for noon today. I will step into the room, present myself as the voice of stability, and the board will enthusiastically hand me your crown. Nate stared at the man. He saw the rot underneath the expensive fabric. He saw a coward who fought battles by aiming at the defenseless. You think power is defined by the collateral damage you are willing to inflict, Nate said, his voice dropping an octave, echoing through the server racks. Power built on someone else's pain is just a borrowed collapse. You haven't won anything. You have just guaranteed your own destruction. Bradley laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. And who will destroy me? You? A man who cannot even afford a prescription refill? The system is designed to crush men like you, Mr. Wright. It operates flawlessly. I simply push the button. Bradley turned his attention back to Kate. The fraud hold remains on the insurance policy. However, I am not a monster. I will personally authorize a discretionary corporate grant to cover the child's surgery in full. All you have to do, Kate, is sign the document I left on your desk upstairs. A voluntary transfer of all voting shares effective immediately. You resign quietly due to personal health reasons. The scandal disappears. The janitor gets his money. Everyone walks away. Kate stared at her former fiancé. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal finally crystallized in the freezing air. He wasn't just trying to take her company. He was trying to humiliate her, break her spirit, and force her to surrender her legacy to save an innocent child. I will see you in federal prison, Kate promised, every word a jagged shard of ice. You will see me at the noon board meeting. Bradley turned on his heel. You have until 11:30 to sign the resignation. After that, the grant offer expires and the child's medical expenses remain entirely unapproved. Do not test my resolve, Kate. I am holding all the cards. He walked away, disappearing into the labyrinth of blinking lights and roaring fans. The heavy elevator doors slid open in the distance, swallowed him, and closed with a final, echoing thud. Nate turned back to the locked HR terminal. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. He reached out and placed his hands on the cold steel console. He didn't smash it. He simply closed his eyes, mapping the digital architecture of the entire building in his mind. "We need a terminal on the outside," Nate stated, opening his eyes. The tactical block in his mind had engaged completely. He severed the local root access. He air-gapped this specific server from the internal network to prevent a remote override. But he didn't sever the financial logs we mirrored yesterday. "The mirrored logs won't unfreeze the insurance," Kate said, her voice trembling for the first time. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind the crushing reality of Bradley's ultimatum. He holds the money. He holds the media narrative. The media narrative is a distraction, a smoke grenade. Nate stepped away from the console, grabbing her arm, pulling her back toward the elevators. He is creating a public scandal to force a rushed vote at noon. He wants the board panicked and reactive. If they vote to oust you today, they won't look at the Q3 routing numbers until it's too late. "Nate, Mia has less than 40 hours. Without that corporate grant, the hospital will not wheel her into the operating room." He cornered us. "We do not purchase our future with the currency of blackmail." Nate hit the elevator call button. He thinks he severed my access to the system. He thinks I am just a guy with a mop. He forgot who built the predictive algorithms securing the offshore accounts. The doors opened. They stepped inside. "Where are we going?" Kate asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hope. "You are going back to the hospital. You are going to sit next to my daughter. You are going to tell her the dragon is guarding the castle." Nate looked straight ahead as the elevator descended. "I am going to the penthouse. I have 8 hours to dismantle a billionaire's firewall from a home office." Dawn broke over Manhattan like a bruised, gray wound. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and reflecting the sickly yellow light of the morning traffic. Inside the pediatric intensive care unit, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hissing of the ventilator and the steady, terrifyingly fast beeping of the heart monitor. Kate sat in a hard plastic chair beside the hospital bed. She had not slept. She had not changed out of her clothes from the night before. Her pristine armor was wrinkled, her perfect hair slightly undone. She stared at the small, fragile figure tangled in a web of translucent tubes and wires. Mia looked incredibly small. Her dark curls were flattened against the thin hospital pillow. Her skin had a terrifyingly pale, almost translucent quality, mapping the delicate blue veins beneath the surface. Her chest rose and fell in a forced, artificial rhythm dictated by the machine beside her. Kate reached through the rails of the bed. Her fingers hovered over Mia's small hand, afraid to touch the IV line taped to the back of the child's wrist. Finally, she let her fingertips rest gently against Mia's skin. It was shockingly cold. A heavy, suffocating wave of grief washed over Kate. It was an entirely new sensation. She had mourned her parents when they died, a distant, quiet sorrow. She had mourned the betrayal of her engagement with a sharp, burning anger. But this was different. This was a visceral, tearing pain in the center of her chest. This was the terror of profound attachment. She had known this child for barely a week. Yet, looking at the slow rise and fall of the blanket, Kate realized her entire empire, her billions in assets, her corner office meant absolutely nothing compared to the desperate need for Mia to open her eyes and ask for her purple crayons. Her phone vibrated aggressively in her coat pocket. Kate pulled it out. The screen was an explosion of notifications, missed calls from board members, frantic texts from her PR director, alerts from major financial news networks. Bradley had not bluffed. The tabloid article had dropped precisely at 6 in the morning. Kate tapped the browser icon. The screen loaded. The damage was catastrophic. The article was a masterclass in character assassination. It didn't just expose the marriage timeline. It weaponized every societal prejudice available. It painted Nate as a predatory grifter from the slums, manipulating a lonely, desperate female executive. It published the eviction notices from Nate's old apartment building. It published the exact balance of his overdrawn checking account. It was a total, systematic annihilation of their dignity. The comments section was a toxic wasteland of classist vitriol. Shareholders were already panicking on the message boards. The pre-market trading data showed Sinclair Global stock plummeting by 7%. A catastrophic hemorrhage of value based entirely on a fabricated narrative of instability. Another text flashed across the top of the screen. From Richard Caldwell, the chairman of the board. Emergency session confirmed for 12 p.m. Bradley has filed a motion for immediate removal. You need a miracle, Kate, or you need to resign gracefully to stop the bleeding. I cannot hold the wolves back. Kate locked the screen. The glass went black, reflecting her hollow eyes. She looked back at Mia. The heart monitor beeped, a sharp, high-pitched demand for survival. The weight of Bradley's ultimatum settled heavily on her shoulders. Sign the resignation, surrender the company. And Bradley would authorize the medical funds. Mia would get the surgery. Nate would not lose his entire world. She stood up slowly. Her legs felt weak, numb from hours of sitting in the harsh hospital chair. She walked out of the ICU room, the heavy glass door sliding shut behind her, sealing Mia back in the sterile bubble. Kate navigated the maze of hospital corridors until she found the quiet, secluded waiting area at the end of the wing. She sat down at a small laminate table. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside was the document Bradley had drafted, a comprehensive, legally binding transfer of power, a total capitulation. She unscrewed the cap of her platinum fountain pen. She stared at the signature line at the bottom of the dense legal text. For 15 years, Sinclair Global had been her entire identity. She had built it from a mid-tier analytics firm into a global titan. She had sacrificed every personal relationship, every moment of peace, every shred of her own humanity to construct that empire. It was her legacy. It was the only proof she had that her existence mattered. But as she held the pen over the paper, she realized the empire was entirely empty. A fortress of glass and steel with no one inside to protect. She thought of Nate sitting on the floor of the penthouse in the dark, offering her water and demanding she learn how to live. She thought of Mia sliding a drawing of a blue dragon across a marble counter, offering an unconditional shield to a stranger. A foundation built on a lie will collapse the moment the wind changes direction. She didn't want the empire anymore. She wanted the breakfast table. She wanted the burned toast. She wanted the terrible, wonderful vulnerability of being needed by someone who couldn't be bought. She lowered the pen. The platinum nib touched the paper. A large, calloused hand clamped down over hers, stopping the motion entirely. Kate gasped, her head snapping up. Nate stood beside the table. He was breathing heavily, his clothes damp with the morning rain. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, bruised circles of absolute exhaustion. But the intensity radiating from him was staggering. He didn't pull the pen away. He simply held her hand in place, exerting a gentle, immovable pressure. "What are you doing, Kate?" His voice was a rasp, raw and scraped hollow. "I am saving her." Kate's voice trembled. A single tear broke free, tracking down her cheek. "He released the article, Nate. The board is moving to oust me at noon. If I fight him and lose, the fraud hold remains on the insurance. We run out of time. If I sign this, he clears the funds immediately. The hospital preps the OR. You are surrendering your life's work to a terrorist. My life's work is a company. It is just money, Nate." She looked up at him, her defenses completely shattered, laying her soul bare in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room. "I can't let her die. I can't let you lose the only thing that matters to you. Not when I have the power to stop it. Let me do this, please." Nate looked down at the woman who had offered him $500,000 just days ago to disappear. She was now offering to destroy her own legacy to keep his family intact. The sheer, overwhelming depth of her sacrifice hit him like a physical blow. He moved his hand, gently taking the platinum pen from her fingers. He clicked the cap back on and tossed it onto the table. He picked up the manila folder, folded it in half, and tore the thick legal document straight down the middle. No. Kate stared at the torn pieces of paper. Nate, you don't understand the timeline. I understand perfectly. Nate grabbed a chair and pulled it close to hers, sitting down so they were at eye level. He leaned in, closing the distance between them. I can rebuild a shattered company from the ground up, but I will not build my family's survival on the ashes of your surrender. We don't have a choice. We always have a choice. Nate's voice grew fierce. You listen to me. Bradley thinks he can break us because he believes everyone has a price. He believes you value power over people, and he believes I value survival over dignity. He is wrong on both counts. He holds the access to the funds. He holds a digital lock, and I am the man who breaks locks. Nate reached into his damp jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek black external hard drive and placed it on the laminate table next to the torn resignation letter. Kate looked at the drive. What is that? That is the final nail in Bradley Lawson's coffin. Nate leaned back, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. I spent the last 7 hours tearing apart the secondary firewalls on the mirrored data. He buried the charity fund routing numbers under a polyalphabetic cipher. Military-grade encryption. It was brilliant. How did you break it? I stopped looking at the math and started looking at the man. Nate offered a grim, exhausted smile. An ego that massive leaves fingerprints. He didn't use a random number generator for the cipher key. He used a date. The date you broke off your engagement. He weaponized his own rejection to secure his stolen money. Kate felt a chill run down her spine. The absolute sociopathic arrogance of the man she had almost married. The drive contains the unencrypted routing logs, Nate continued, his voice steadying. It proves he siphoned $8 million from the corporate charity fund. But that's not the payload. The payload is where the money went. Nate tapped the hard drive with a heavy index finger. He didn't just steal the money to get rich. He routed it through a series of offshore holding companies directly into the primary acquisition accounts of Patterson Global. Kate's breath caught in her throat. Patterson Global, their biggest competitor, the conglomerate currently attempting to undercut Sinclair's market share in Europe. The hostile takeover isn't just a grab for the CEO chair, Nate explained, laying the entire conspiracy bare. It's a Trojan horse. Bradley has been colluding with Patterson for over a year. He drains the charity fund, uses the stolen capital to buy up Sinclair proxy shares through blind trusts, and orchestrates this media scandal to tank the stock price. The moment the board ousts you today, he assumes control, immediately approves a massive undervaluation merger with Patterson, and walks away with a 9-figure golden parachute. The silence in the waiting room was absolute. The sheer scale of the treason was breathtaking. It wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was the deliberate, systemic dismantling of an entire empire from the inside out. He isn't trying to run your company, Kate, Nate said softly. He's trying to sell it for parts. Kate stared at the black hard drive. The evidence was right there. The key to her survival. The weapon that could obliterate Bradley Lawson. But the shadow of the ICU room still loomed over them. Even with this, Kate's voice was a harsh whisper. The board meeting is at noon. If we present this, it triggers a massive federal investigation. The SEC gets involved. The accounts are frozen pending audit. The insurance fraud hold remains locked in bureaucratic limbo for weeks. Mia doesn't have weeks. She has hours. Which is why we aren't waiting for the federal investigation. Nate stood up. The exhaustion seemed to burn off him, replaced by a terrifying cold momentum. We are going to walk into that boardroom, we are going to lock the doors, and we are going to present this data not as an accusation but as an execution. Nate, the board is already panicked by the tabloids. They are hostile, they won't listen to the man the media just branded a grifter. They won't have a choice. Nate looked down at her. He demanded strength. He demanded the Ice Queen rise from the ashes of her own despair and fight alongside him. You are the CEO. You command the room. I will bring the data. We do not beg for my daughter's life. We take it back. Kate looked at the torn pieces of her resignation letter. She looked at the man standing before her, a man who had refused her money, hacked a billionaire's firewall, and refused to let her sacrifice her own dignity. True authority doesn't shout from the head of the table. It operates quietly while the cowards panic. She reached out and picked up the black hard drive. The metal was cool against her palm. She closed her hand around it, her knuckles turning white. She stood up. The tailored suit seemed to fit her perfectly again. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. I need to wash my face, Kate stated, her voice regaining its sharp, cutting edge. And we need to call Richard Caldwell. Tell him to ensure every single voting member of the board is present at noon. No proxies, no video feeds. I want them in the room. And Bradley? Nate asked. Let him believe he has already won. A dangerous, lethal calm settled over Kate's features. It will make the impact significantly more devastating. They walked back down the long corridor toward the ICU. They stood outside the glass wall, looking in at Mia. The rhythmic breathing of the ventilator continued. The ticking clock. Nate placed his hand flat against the glass. He didn't offer a silent prayer this time. He made a vow. We're coming back for you, baby, he whispered to the glass. Daddy has to go slay a dragon. The drive from the hospital to the Sinclair Global headquarters was entirely different from the midnight raid. The city was awake now, buzzing with frantic mid-morning energy. The rain had cleared, leaving a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off the skyscrapers. The SUV pulled up to the main entrance of the tower. This was not a covert infiltration through the loading dock. This was a frontal assault. The lobby was chaotic. Employees clustered in hushed groups, glancing nervously at their phones, scrolling through the tabloid articles. Security guards looked tense, anticipating a media circus. When the revolving doors spun and Kate Sinclair walked into the lobby, the entire massive atrium went dead silent. She did not look like a woman on the verge of being ousted. She walked with a terrifying, predatory grace. Her heels clicked against the polished granite floor in a steady, militant rhythm. Nate walked exactly half a pace behind her and to her right. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that Kate's assistant had brought to the hospital. He didn't look like a maintenance worker in borrowed clothes. He looked like the executioner. The whispers died in their throats as the pair crossed the lobby. They bypassed the security desk completely. The guards simply stepped back, recognizing the absolute, uncompromising authority radiating from the CEO. They entered the private executive elevator. The doors closed, sealing out the staring eyes. The agenda dictates Bradley speaks first, Kate said, her eyes fixed on the floor indicator tracking their ascent to the top of the tower. He will present the motion for immediate removal based on the media scandal. He will demand a vote before I have the opportunity to address the financial discrepancies. Let him speak. Nate adjusted his cuffs. His mind was rapidly organizing the sequence of the data deployment. Let him build his entire narrative on the foundation of his own lies. The higher he climbs, the harder the concrete feels when he hits it. He will attack your character publicly, in front of the entire board. My character is not up for debate. Nate looked at her, his expression unreadable. I know who I am. He is about to find out who he is. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to the 55th floor, the boardroom level. The corridor was lined with thick, sound-dampening carpet and original abstract art. The heavy mahogany double doors of the main conference room stood closed at the end of the hall. Two massive security details stood outside. Clear the corridor, Kate commanded as she approached. The security guards exchanged a nervous glance, then stepped aside, opening the heavy wooden doors. The Sinclair Global boardroom was a masterclass in corporate intimidation. A massive boat-shaped table carved from a single slab of black walnut dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, placing the occupants above the clouds, masters of the universe. 15 board members sat around the table. The atmosphere was thick with tension, smelling of expensive coffee and barely concealed panic. Laptops were open, financial reports were scattered. The air was heavy with the expectation of an execution. At the far end of the table, standing confidently by the massive digital presentation screen, was Bradley Lawson. He looked up as the doors opened. His smug, victorious smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw Nate walking in beside Kate, but he quickly recovered, smoothing his tie and projecting total control. "Ah, the CEO has decided to join us," Bradley announced, his voice carrying easily across the cavernous room. "And she has brought her +1. How terribly quaint. Though I must remind the room that this is a closed executive session. Non-board members are strictly prohibited." Richard Caldwell, the silver-haired chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table. He looked exhausted, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Kate, the media situation is a catastrophe. The stock is hemorrhaging. We are facing a crisis of confidence, and Bradley is correct. Mr. Wright has no place in this session." Kate did not stop walking. She moved to her chair at the head of the table, directly opposite Bradley. She placed the black hard drive onto the polished walnut surface. The small metallic click echoed loudly. "Mr. Wright is the Vice President of Data Analytics," Kate stated, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. She didn't sit down. She remained standing, commanding the vertical space in the room. "And he is remaining in this room, because the crisis of confidence we are facing has absolutely nothing to do with my marriage, and everything to do with the man currently standing by that screen." A murmur rippled through the board members. Several shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs. Bradley let out a theatrical sigh, shaking his head. "More erratic behavior. Deflecting from the scandal at hand. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I direct your attention to the packet in front of you. Exhibit A is the tabloid release from this morning. A detailed, factual accounting of a fraudulent marriage designed to deceive this very body. It is a profound breach of fiduciary duty." "You leaked the article, Bradley." Kate's accusation was flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact. "I am simply ensuring transparency," Bradley countered smoothly, pacing behind his chair. "The market responds to stability. Sinclair Global cannot be led by a woman who initiates secret back-alley marriages with terminated maintenance workers to fabricate an image of domestic tranquility. It demonstrates a catastrophic lack of judgment. The stock drop this morning is merely a preview of the devastation to come if we do not act immediately." He turned to Richard Caldwell. "Mr. Chairman, I formally move for an immediate vote of no confidence, effective removal of Kate Sinclair as Chief Executive Officer, and the appointment of an interim acting CEO to stabilize the market and reassure our shareholders." The room grew suffocatingly quiet. The guillotine was raised. The blade was hovering. Richard looked at Kate. There was genuine regret in his eyes. He had mentored her. He had watched her build the company. But his ultimate loyalty was to the shareholders. "Kate," Richard said softly, "the optics are indefensible. The market reaction is severe. If you have a defense regarding the timeline of this marriage, now is the time to present it. Otherwise, I must recognize the motion." Kate looked around the room. She looked at the men and women who had profited immensely from her relentless work for over a decade. They were ready to throw her to the wolves based on a tabloid article and a temporary dip in a stock chart. She did not defend the marriage. She did not explain the desperate hospital visit or the extortion attempt. She simply reached out and pushed the black hard drive across the table toward Nate. "I have no defense regarding the timeline of my marriage," Kate announced. her voice echoing off the glass walls. Because it is entirely irrelevant. While Bradley has been manipulating the press to focus your attention on my personal life, he has been orchestrating the systematic financial dismantling of this corporation. She turned to Nate. Mr. Wright, deploy the data. Nate stepped forward. He didn't rush. He picked up the hard drive and walked over to the presentation console. He plugged the drive into the secure port. His hands moved over the keyboard with the same terrifying, blinding speed he had used in the penthouse. What is this? Bradley demanded, his voice rooting a fraction of an octave. The confident smirk began to strain at the edges. Mr. Chairman, I object. This is a desperate distraction tactic. I demand the vote commence immediately. Sit down, Bradley. Richard snapped, his curiosity finally overriding his panic. He looked at Nate. What data are you presenting, Mr. Wright? Nate hit the enter key. The massive digital screen behind Bradley flared to life. The Sinclair Global logo vanished, replaced by a dense, complex web of financial routing architecture. Thousands of data points glowing red against a black background, all converging on a single isolated node. This, Nate began, his voice projecting a deep, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence in the room, is the internal routing log for the Sinclair Global Corporate Charity Fund over the last 24 months. He tapped a key. The screen zoomed in, highlighting specific transactions. 3 weeks ago, in my capacity as an analyst, I flagged a series of micro-divergences in the Q3 projections. Small, seemingly innocuous decimal shifts. They were categorized as system rounding errors by the CFO's office. Nate walked slowly around the edge of the massive table, forcing the board members to turn their heads to follow him. They were not errors. They were a siphon, a slow, methodical bleed. He pointed to the screen. $8 million, siphoned over 2 years. The funds were routed through a rolling cipher designed to evade standard internal audits. It was an elegant piece of code, military-grade encryption. This is fabricated nonsense, Bradley interrupted, stepping away from the screen, his face flushing with angry color. I personally oversee the charity audits. The funds are entirely accounted for. He is projecting manipulated data. The data is pulled directly from the mirrored root directory of the isolated HR mainframe. Nate countered smoothly, not raising his voice. A mainframe you air-gapped at 2 o'clock this morning to hide your tracks. You forgot that a system is only as secure as the arrogance of its administrator. Nate tapped a button on a remote presenter. The screen shifted again. The complex web dissolved, replaced by a stark, undeniable spreadsheet. The encryption cipher used a specific non-random sequence as a key, Nate explained, looking directly at Bradley. A personal date. Once I broke the cipher, the destination of the stolen funds became transparent. The spreadsheet displayed clear, unredacted bank routing numbers. The origin accounts belonged to the Sinclair Charity Fund. The destination accounts were listed under a holding company. Apex Ventures, LLC. Apex Ventures is a shell corporation registered in Delaware, Nate continued, the relentless rhythm of his presentation dismantling Bradley piece by piece. Registered to an Elena Lawson, your sister Bradley. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Several board members leaned forward, staring at the screen in absolute shock. The atmosphere shifted violently from a political execution to a crime scene investigation. It's a lie, Bradley shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The veneer of the sophisticated executive cracked, revealing the panicked animal underneath. He hacked the system. He planted those numbers. He is an unvetted, disgruntled former employee seeking revenge for a justified termination. Desperation is the loudest alarm, Nate said softly, quoting the reality of the room. But precision is the blade that cuts the wire. Nate pressed the remote one final time. The ultimate payload. The screen shifted to a series of heavily encrypted emails, fully decrypted and displayed in massive text. The sender was Bradley Lawson. The recipient was the chief executive officer of Patterson Global. The $8 million was not for personal enrichment. Nate delivered the final crushing blow. It was seed capital. Bradley utilized the stolen charity funds to covertly purchase Sinclair Global proxy shares through blind trusts. Artificially inflating the Patterson voting bloc, he orchestrated the media scandal today to tank our stock price, providing Patterson Global the leverage required to execute a hostile takeover at a catastrophic undervaluation. Nate turned off the screen. The room was plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. He looked around the table at the pale faces of the billionaires and executives. "He wasn't trying to save your company from a PR scandal," Nate stated, his voice a hammer driving the final nail. "He was holding the back door open while a competitor robbed you blind, and he was going to charge you for the privilege." Richard Caldwell sat frozen in his chair. He looked at the blank screen, then slowly turned his head to look at the CFO. Bradley was backed against the glass wall. His face was the color of wet ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute undeniable proof of his treason was laid bare before the most powerful people in his industry. The trap he had built for Kate had become his own tomb. "Bradley," Richard's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a terrifying, contained fury. "Is this true?" "Richard, you have to listen to me," Bradley stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. The Patterson merger was inevitable. I was simply positioning us for a more favorable restructuring. The charity funds were a temporary liquidity bridge. You stole from dying children to sell our company to our biggest rival." Kate's voice cut through his pathetic excuses like a serrated blade. She stood at the head of the table, the undisputed ruler of the room. "You weaponized my personal life, and you intentionally blocked the life-saving medical insurance of a 6-year-old girl to force my resignation." The horror on the faces of the board members deepened. Embezzlement was one thing, corporate treason was another, but the detail about the medical insurance pushed the betrayal into the realm of the sociopathic. "Security!" Richard barked, reaching for the console embedded in the table. Before he could press the button, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. 3 men in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed across the back stepped into the boardroom. They did not look intimidated by the wealth or the view. They looked like men who had a job to do. "Bradley Lawson," the lead agent announced, holding up a federal warrant. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and violation of the Securities Exchange Act. Step away from the window and place your hands behind your back." Bradley stared at the agents. The reality of his total destruction finally crashed over him. He looked at Kate, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You called them," Bradley whispered. "I called them at 4 a.m, Kate confirmed, her face a mask of absolute, unforgiving justice. "I sent the unencrypted routing logs directly to the field office. I told you, Bradley, I will see you in federal prison." The agents moved swiftly, snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto Bradley's wrists. The sharp click echoed loudly in the silent room. They marched the former CFO out of the boardroom, a humiliating public procession of defeat. The heavy doors closed behind them. The boardroom remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. The execution had taken place, but the wrong head had rolled. The board members looked at Kate, and then they looked at Nate, the maintenance man, the grifter, the husband. He stood near the presentation screen, his posture relaxed but commanding. You can strip the title from the man, but you cannot strip the competence from his hands. Richard Caldwell slowly stood up from his chair. He looked at the empty space where Bradley had been standing, then turned his gaze down the long table to Kate. "Kate," Richard cleared his throat. The arrogance completely bled out of his voice. "I believe I speak for the entire board when I offer our profoundest apologies. The motion for removal is dismissed. Furthermore, I will personally contact the major media outlets to issue a comprehensive retraction and clarification regarding Mr. Lawson's arrest and his manipulation of the press." Kate didn't smile. She didn't offer gracious acceptance. She simply nodded once. "Ensure the press release highlights the stabilization of the charity fund. And Richard, Yes, Kate? Authorize an immediate unilateral corporate override on all frozen employee benefits, specifically the medical insurance profile of Nathaniel Wright. Execute it before you leave this room. Consider it done. Richard didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he typed the urgent directive. Kate looked at Nate. The war in the boardroom was over. The Empire was secure, the enemy was in custody. But as they locked eyes across the massive walnut table, the corporate victory dissolved. The only thing that mattered was the ticking clock in a hospital room miles away. The real battle was just beginning. The descent from the 55th floor lacked the suffocating velocity of their arrival. The elevator glided downward in a smooth, silent surrender to gravity, leaving the shattered remains of Bradley Lawson's corporate coup high above the Manhattan skyline. The battle for Sinclair Global was over. The Empire was secure, yet standing in the polished steel cage, the victory tasted entirely like ash. The adrenaline that had fueled the confrontation in the boardroom was evaporating rapidly, leaving behind a cold, hollow vacuum. The real war was not fought with unencrypted routing logs or emergency shareholder votes. The real war was being waged on a surgical table miles away, measured in millimeters of failing cardiac tissue. Nate leaned heavily against the back wall of the elevator. He loosened the silk tie at his throat, pulling the knot down with a sharp, violent tug. The expensive fabric felt like a noose. He stared at the digital floor indicator, watching the numbers drop. 50, 40, 30, every descending digit was a second lost. His breathing was shallow, a mirror of the terrifying rhythm he had witnessed in the hallway of the penthouse. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands against his brow. The image of the police escorting the treacherous CFO out in handcuffs offered absolutely no solace. Justice was a sterile concept when weighed against the fragile heartbeat of a child. Kate stood near the doors. Her posture remained impeccably straight, but the rigid, untouchable aura of the Ice Queen had vanished, replaced by a raw, vibrating urgency. She clutched her leather briefcase to her chest like a physical shield. Her knuckles were stark white. The executive armor she had worn for 15 years had been permanently breached. She had witnessed a man walk into the epicenter of her power, dismantle her greatest enemy, and demand nothing but the preservation of his family. The tectonic plates of her entire psychological foundation had shifted, snapping the fault lines of her isolation. She was no longer a solitary monarch defending a glass fortress. She was part of a terrifying, vulnerable collective. The heavy doors chimed and slid open to the ground floor lobby. The atrium was a storm of chaotic energy. News crews had breached the outer security perimeter, pressing their camera lenses against the revolving glass doors. Microphones were thrust forward like weapons. The tabloid scandal had ignited a media frenzy, and the sudden appearance of the FBI had poured gasoline on the fire. Flashes of harsh white light exploded in rapid succession, blinding in their intensity. Nate stepped forward, his body naturally shifting to shield Kate from the onslaught of flashbulbs. He reached out, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, guiding her through the gauntlet. He did not lower his head. He did not hide his face. He walked with the terrifying absolute certainty of a man who had absolutely nothing left to conceal. A barrage of shouted questions echoed off the granite walls. "Ms. Sinclair, are the allegations of embezzlement true? Mr. Wright, is the marriage a corporate smokescreen? What is the current valuation of the Patterson merger?" Kate ignored them entirely. Her focus was locked on the black SUV idling at the curb. The corporate crisis was a distant, irrelevant hum. The media circus was a microscopic inconvenience. "Drive," Kate commanded the moment the heavy vehicle doors slammed shut, sealing them inside the soundproof interior. "Do not stop for traffic. Use the emergency siren if you have to." The driver, a seasoned security professional, engaged the hidden grille lights. The SUV lunged forward, cutting a violent path through the congested Midtown avenues. The wail of the siren sliced through the dense urban noise, clearing a channel of asphalt. The interior of the vehicle was silent. Nate stared out the tinted window at the blurring city blocks. The rain had started again, driving hard against the glass, distorting the world outside into smeared streaks of gray and neon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of shattered glass originating from the corner where he had dropped it in the hospital waiting room hours ago. He accessed the secure hospital portal. A single blinking green notification rested at the top of the interface. Insurance authorization. Approved. Status. Cleared for immediate surgical intervention. Nate let out a long, shuddering breath. The heavy, crushing weight pressing down on his chest lifted by a fraction of an inch. The path was clear. The final bureaucratic obstacle had been obliterated by the sheer force of their combined will. He turned the screen toward Kate. She stared at the green text, the absolute validation of their brutal morning assault. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the rigid tension leaving her spine. She reached across the leather seat. Her hand, trembling with the aftermath of pure adrenaline, found his. Her fingers intertwined with his, a silent, desperate anchor in the storm. The SUV swerved sharply, pulling into the emergency loading zone of the pediatric hospital. They moved through the sliding glass doors with terrifying singular purpose. The sterile, aggressive smell of iodine and industrial bleach hit them instantly. The transition from the opulent mahogany boardroom to the harsh, fluorescent reality of the medical facility was jarring. The ambient noise shifted from the hushed, calculated whispers of executives to the chaotic, desperate hum of saving lives. Gurneys clattered down the linoleum corridors. The sharp, rhythmic beeping of telemetry monitors echoed from open doorways. They reached the pediatric intensive care unit. The heavy security doors required a specialized pass. Kate slammed her palm against the intercom button. "Nathaniel Wright," Kate announced, her voice brooking no delay. "We are here for Mia." The heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a loud clack. They practically sprinted down the long, brightly lit corridor. Room 412. The door was propped open. A flurry of coordinated medical activity was already underway inside. Nate stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Mia was no longer resting. She was surrounded by a team of surgical nurses dressed in pale green scrubs. A mobile telemetry cart was hooked up to her small chest, the wires tracing a terrifying map across her pale skin. An anesthesiologist, a tall man with kind eyes and a blue surgical cap, was adjusting the flow rate on a complex intravenous drip. "Daddy." The word was a fragile, raspy whisper, barely audible over the hum of the machinery. Nate crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He dropped to his knees beside the specialized pediatric bed. He ignored the nurses carefully maneuvering the equipment around him. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "I am right here, baby," Nate murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to break him completely. "Daddy is right here. I slew the dragon. The castle is safe." Mia managed a weak, exhausted smile. Her dark eyes, usually so sharp and observant, were heavily clouded by the initial doses of preoperative sedatives. Her skin was terrifyingly cold to the touch. The blue tint around her lips had deepened, a stark visual indicator of the failing oxygenation in her bloodstream. "I'm sleepy," Mia whispered, her eyelids fluttering. "The heavy hug is really tight now." "I know, sweetie, I know." Nate gently brushed the dark curls away from her clammy forehead. "But the doctors are going to fix it today. They are going to take the heavy hug away forever. You are going to wake up, and you are going to breathe so easy." Kate stepped up to the opposite side of the bed. She moved with hesitant, agonizing care, terrified of disrupting the intricate web of medical tubing. She looked down at the child who had offered her a crayon drawing of protection. The child who had correctly identified the profound, suffocating loneliness hiding behind the CEO's tailored suits. Mia turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Kate. "You came back," Mia noted, the slight slur in her voice betraying the advancing sedation. "Did you bring the blue dragon?" Kate felt a sudden violent constriction in her throat. The boardroom victories, the billions in corporate valuation, the absolute destruction of her enemies, none of it meant anything. The only thing that mattered was answering this impossible question correctly. "I brought him," Kate whispered, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual commanding resonance. She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She pulled out the folded, slightly crumpled piece of drawing paper. She carefully opened it, displaying the crude, waxy lines of the blue dragon to the fading child. "He is guarding us perfectly. He didn't let any bad guys inside." Mia's smile widened a fraction. "Good. You have to keep him. He likes you." The lead cardiac surgeon entered the room. Dr. Eris Thorne. A woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a sterile cap and eyes that projected absolute uncompromising competence. She carried a thick metal clipboard. "Mr. Wright, Miss Sinclair." Dr. Thorne's voice was calm, a steadying fu in the chaotic room. "The insurance hold has been fully cleared. The surgical suite is prepped and waiting. We are ready to initiate transport." Nate stood up slowly. His joints felt locked, frozen with a terror deeper than anything he had ever experienced. "What are the exact parameters?" "The acute exacerbation has accelerated our timeline, but the fundamental surgical plan remains intact," Dr. Thorne explained, her tone professional but deeply empathetic. "We are going in to repair the ventricular septal defect and reconstruct the compromised pulmonary valve. The sudden fluid buildup has weakened the surrounding tissue, which elevates the baseline risk. We are looking at a highly complex, open-heart procedure. 6 to 8 hours on the table. We will place her on a cardiopulmonary bypass machine to sustain oxygenation while we reconstruct the heart muscle." "And the risk of failure?" Kate asked, demanding the raw data. She needed the numbers to process the horror. "The mortality rate for this specific advanced stage reconstruction is approximately 18%. Dr. Thorne delivered the statistic without flinching. "It is a severe number, but without the intervention today, the mortality rate is absolute. We have the best pediatric cardiac team in the hemisphere scrubbed in and ready. We are going to fight for her." Nate looked back down at his daughter. 18%, 1 in 5. A game of terrifying high-stakes biological roulette. He had spent his entire career building predictive models to eliminate risk. He had hacked a billionaire's firewall to secure a guaranteed outcome. But standing in the harsh light of the ICU, he was completely, utterly powerless. He could not code a patch for a failing organic valve. He could not out-negotiate death. He leaned down and pressed his lips against Mia's forehead. He lingered there, breathing in the scent of her skin, memorizing the exact texture of her hair. "I love you, Mia," Nate whispered against her skin. "More than the sun, more than the stars. You fight hard today. You hear me? You are my brave girl." "I will fight, Daddy." Mia's eyes were almost entirely closed now. The sedatives were dragging her into the deep, artificial sleep required for the trauma ahead. "Tell Mommy I love her." The words struck Nate like a physical blow to the sternum. He closed his eyes, the grief for his lost wife colliding violently with the terror of losing his child. "I will tell her, baby, I promise." The surgical nurses disengaged the brakes on the bed. "It is time," the anesthesiologist announced gently. Nate stepped back. He grabbed Kate's hand, his grip bone-crushing. They followed the rolling bed out of the room, marching down the long, bright corridor toward the surgical wing. The rhythmic squeak of the rubber wheels against the linoleum sounded like a countdown. They reached the heavy double doors marked "Authorized Surgical Personnel Only." Sterile environment. The nurses pushed the bed through the threshold. Dr. Thorne paused in the doorway. "We will send a liaison out to the primary waiting area every 90 minutes with an update," Dr. Thorne promised. "Try to breathe. We have her." The heavy doors swung shut with a definitive, hollow thud. The magnetic locks engaged. They were gone. Nate stood staring at the blank metal doors. The world had just shrunk down to a single terrifying binary outcome. The massive, sprawling complexity of his life had been reduced to a coin flip happening inside a sterile room. He placed his hands flat against the cold metal of the doors, resting his forehead against the surface. Kate stood beside him. She did not offer empty assurances. She understood the insult of false hope. Instead, she stepped closer, pressing her shoulder against his, a silent, unwavering pillar of shared endurance. "We wait," Kate stated, her voice quiet but absolute. They walked to the primary surgical waiting area. It was a large, sterile room furnished with uncomfortable modular chairs, outdated magazines, and a television bolted to the corner playing an endlessly cheerful daytime talk show on mute. The walls were painted a generic, soothing pastel blue that did absolutely nothing to soothe the raw terror radiating from the occupants. 3 other families occupied the space, a young couple huddled together, weeping silently. An older man staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee. The room was a purgatory of suspended animation. Nate chose a secluded corner by a large window overlooking the dreary, rain-soaked city. He sat down in a rigid plastic chair. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring intently at the pattern of the industrial carpet. Kate sat next to him, She placed her briefcase on the floor. She did not open her laptop. She did not check the plunging stock prices or the frantic emails from her board. The corporate empire had ceased to exist. The first hour dragged past with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like wading through deep, viscous mud. Nate could not sit still. He stood up, pacing the length of the window. His mind was a chaotic storm of statistical probabilities and terrifying medical imagery. He imagined the cold steel of the scalpel. He imagined the terrifying silence of the bypass machine, taking over the function of a human heart. "She is resilient," Kate offered softly, tracking his frantic pacing. "She survived the acute attack in the hallway. She survived the delay. She is fighting." Resilience is not a mathematical guarantee. Nate stopped pacing, turning to face the window. Sarah was resilient. Sarah fought the cancer with everything she had. She endured 6 rounds of experimental chemotherapy. She smiled through the absolute agony. And she still died on a Tuesday morning while it was raining. The confession hung in the sterile air, heavy with the weight of unhealed trauma. "You think this is a repetition?" Kate observed, her analytical mind cutting straight to the core of his psychological terror. "You think the universe is demanding a toll you already paid. The universe doesn't negotiate, Kate. It just takes." Nate leaned his head against the cold glass of the window. "I promised Sarah I would protect Mia. It was the last thing I said to her. I promised I would keep our daughter safe. If I fail today, I don't just lose my child. I break my sacred vow to the woman I loved." Kate stood up. She walked over to him, standing silently by his side, looking out at the same bleak, rain-washed skyline. "Grief is a ghost that only leaves when you build a house it cannot haunt," Kate said, her voice dropping to a whisper, revealing a profound, hard-won wisdom. "You are not failing her, Nate. You fought a billionaire to secure this surgery. You dismantled a corporate coup to buy her this chance. Protection is not about guaranteeing survival. It is about waging absolute war against the darkness. You waged the war. The outcome is in the hands of the surgeons now." Nate turned to look at her. The Ice Queen was entirely gone. The woman standing beside him possessed a deep, resonant empathy forged in the fires of her own profound isolation. She understood the crushing weight of powerlessness. "How do you bear it?" Nate asked, his voice cracking. "The waiting. I don't," Kate admitted, her armor completely stripped away. "I have controlled every variable in my life for 15 years to avoid this exact sensation. I built Sinclair Global because data does not die on an operating table. Numbers do not break your heart, but looking at that little girl, realizing she is the most important thing in this world, Kate swallowed hard, tears finally welling in her eyes. I am terrified, Nate. I am absolutely terrified. He reached out, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder. They clung to each other in the quiet corner of the purgatory waiting room. Two people who had spent their lives fighting battles alone, finally collapsing into the safety of a shared burden. The second hour passed, then the third. A surgical liaison, a young nurse in green scrubs, emerged through the heavy double doors. She carried a tablet. Nate and Kate were on their feet instantly, intercepting her halfway across the room. Update on Mia Wright, the nurse read from the screen, her tone professional. Dr. Thorne has successfully accessed the thoracic cavity. The bypass machine has been engaged. The heart is currently stopped and the surgical field is clear. They have isolated the septal defect and are beginning the reconstruction phase. Vitals remain stable within the expected surgical parameters. The patch? Nate demanded, needing specific operational details. Are they using the synthetic graft or the pericardial tissue? Dr. Thorne opted for the pericardial tissue patch to ensure maximum long-term integration, the nurse confirmed. It is a more complex suturing process, but it yields a much lower rejection rate. She is doing well. I will be back in 90 minutes. The nurse retreated behind the locked doors. Nate exhaled, a long, ragged breath. The heart was stopped. The terrifying reality of the bypass machine was underway. His daughter was currently existing in a state of suspended biological animation. They returned to their chairs. The tension in the room did not dissipate. It merely mutated from the terror of the unknown to the terror of the ongoing procedure. Hour 4 arrived. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the thick pane glass in violent, rhythmic sheets. Kate had finally opened her laptop, not to review corporate data, but to distract her mind. She was staring blankly at a sprawling spreadsheet, the numbers entirely meaningless. Nate was sitting with his eyes closed, his hands clasped together in a silent, continuous loop of prayer. Suddenly, the harsh, blaring sound of an emergency code alarm ripped through the waiting area. Code blue, surgical suite 4, code blue. The automated voice echoed from the ceiling speakers, followed immediately by the frantic sound of running footsteps echoing down the adjacent hallway. A crash cart rattled violently past the waiting room windows, pushed by a sprinting team of critical care specialists. Nate's eyes snapped open. The blood drained entirely from his face. Surgical Suite 4. That was Mia's room. He lunged out of his chair. He sprinted across the waiting room, slamming his hands against the heavy magnetic doors leading to the surgical wing. They were locked tight. He slammed his fists against the metal, a primal, terrified roar tearing from his throat. "Open the door! Open the goddamn door!" Kate was beside him in an instant, grabbing his arms, trying to pull him back from the reinforced steel. "Nate, stop! You cannot breach the sterile field! Stop! It's Mia! They called a code!" Nate thrashed against her grip, his entire body rigid with absolute, unadulterated panic. The carefully constructed logic of his mind had shattered completely. The ghost of his wife's death was screaming in his ears. "Look at me!" Kate shouted, her voice echoing with the absolute authority she usually reserved for the boardroom. She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Look at me! You are panicking. You are losing focus." Her heart stopped, Kate. Her heart was already stopped. They are on bypass. Kate's mind raced, processing the medical data they had been given against the emergency code. A code blue in a bypass suite indicates a sudden pressure drop or a machine failure, not a primary cardiac arrest. The team is in there. Dr. Thorne is in there. Banging on a metal door will not save her. You have to hold the line, Nate. You have to hold the line. He stared into her eyes. He saw the sheer, terrifying force of her will holding back the tidal wave of his panic. The logic of her words penetrated the fog of his terror. The bypass machine. The pressure drop. He slowly stopped thrashing. His breathing was rapid, jagged gasps tearing through his chest. He collapsed against the heavy metal doors, sliding down to the cold linoleum floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in his arms. Kate sank down beside him. She did not speak. She simply wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders, anchoring him to the physical world while his mind descended into the darkest abyss of human fear. The next 45 minutes were an agonizing exercise in psychological torture. No liaison emerged, no updates were provided, the alarm had been silenced, replaced by an oppressive, terrifying vacuum of information. Nate stared at a tiny scuff mark on the hospital floor. He bargained with every known deity. He offered his own life, his own heartbeat, his own soul in exchange for the survival of the small girl lying on the surgical table. He mentally traded every single day of his future just to hear her ask for a purple crayon one more time. True victory isn't the destruction of your enemies, but the preservation of your soul. He realized, sitting on the cold floor of the hospital, that he did not care about the vice president title. He did not care about the data analytics or the corporate victories. He had waged war for dignity and respect, but in the end, love was the only currency that held any actual value in the face of absolute darkness. Finally, the heavy magnetic locks on the double doors disengaged with a loud, echoing clack. Nate and Kate scrambled to their feet. Dr. Thorne walked through the doors. She had removed her surgical mask. Her green scrubs were stained with small, terrifying specks of dark crimson. Her silver hair was damp with sweat beneath the surgical cap. She looked utterly exhausted, bearing the physical toll of a brutal, high-stakes battle. She stopped a few feet away from them. The expression on her face was completely unreadable. Nate's heart stopped beating. The air was sucked out of the room. He could not form a word. He stood paralyzed, waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. Dr. Thorne let out a long, slow breath. The harsh lines of exhaustion around her eyes softened. The code blue was a catastrophic drop in the bypass machine's arterial pressure line, Dr. Thorne explained, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the crisis. We experienced a sudden severe hemorrhage at the primary graft site during the rewarming phase. The tissue was more fragile than anticipated. Kate gripped Nate's hand so tightly her nails dug into his skin. We clamped the artery. We bypassed the failing machine valve. We instituted an immediate mass transfusion protocol. Dr. Thorne continued, detailing the harrowing fight for life. It took us 22 minutes to stabilize the pressure and secure the graft. It was incredibly close, Dr. Thorne paused, offering a small, profoundly human smile. But we secured it. The graft held. We successfully weaned her off the bypass machine 10 minutes ago. Her heart is beating on its own, Mr. Wright. The defect is closed. The rhythm is strong and steady. The surgery was a success. The words hit Nate like a physical shockwave. His knees buckled. He would have collapsed to the floor if Kate had not caught him, wrapping her arms around his waist, holding him upright. A harsh, tearing sob ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated salvation. He buried his face in Kate's neck, weeping with the absolute abandon of a man who had been handed back his entire universe from the edge of the abyss. Kate held him, her own tears flowing freely, silent tracks of moisture cutting through the pristine makeup she had applied over 24 hours ago. She looked at Dr. Thorne, mouthing the words, "Thank you," because her voice had entirely failed her. "She is being transferred to the cardiac intensive care recovery wing," Dr. Thorne instructed gently. "She will remain deeply sedated for the next 12 to 18 hours to allow the sternum to stabilize. You can see her in 30 minutes. Go wash your faces, you survived." The surgeon turned and walked away, disappearing back down the corridor, a soldier returning to the front lines. Nate slowly pulled back. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his chest heaving with the residual shock of the adrenaline crash. He looked at Kate. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair slightly messy, her tailored suit hopelessly wrinkled. She had never looked more beautiful. They walked toward the small, secluded alcove near the recovery wing to wait out the final 30 minutes. The oppressive silence of the waiting room had been shattered. replaced by the quiet, ringing hum of absolute relief. Kate stopped by a small, sterile window looking out into an interior courtyard. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. The immediate crisis had passed, and the terrifying reality of the emotional aftermath was rapidly setting in. She had stripped away every layer of her armor over the last 48 hours. She had fought for a child she didn't birth, supported a man she barely knew, and surrendered her entire corporate identity to save them. The Ice Queen had melted entirely, leaving behind a woman completely exposed to the elements. She felt an overwhelming, desperate need to retreat, to rebuild the walls, to categorize the overwhelming, terrifying flood of emotion into neat, manageable corporate metrics. She turned to Nate. She cleared her throat, attempting to summon the ghosts of the boardroom. "I believe we have successfully navigated the primary crisis parameters," Kate began, her voice stiff, artificially formal. She smoothed the lapels of her wrinkled blazer. "The surgical intervention was optimal. And regarding the incident with Bradley this morning, I appreciate your strategic partnership. The data deployment was flawless. The synergy we demonstrated effectively neutralized the hostile takeover." Nate stopped. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He saw exactly what she was doing. He saw the panic behind the corporate jargon. He saw the terrified woman frantically trying to rebuild the fortress. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, invading the professional distance she was trying to establish. "Stop," Nate commanded, his voice low, a gentle but immovable force. Kate flinched slightly. "I am merely attempting to express my gratitude for your execution of the strategic objectives. Our contract stipulated a mutual benefit, and you have vastly exceeded the anticipated ROI. I said stop, Kate." Nate took another step, closing the distance completely. He reached out and gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "We are not in the boardroom. There is no contract, there is no ROI. Stop hiding." Kate looked away, staring fiercely at the sterile white wall. Her breathing accelerated. "I am not hiding. I am contextualizing the events." "Vulnerability is the heaviest armor a person can wear," Nate said softly, his thumbs gently brushing the tense muscles of her neck. "You wore it perfectly today. Don't take it off now." "You don't understand," Kate whispered, her voice trembling, the corporate facade fracturing under his gentle pressure. "If I don't contextualize this, if I actually acknowledge what just happened, what I feel right now, acknowledge it. If I acknowledge it, I have nothing to protect me when you leave." Kate finally looked at him, her eyes wide with a profound, deeply rooted terror, the fear of the abandoned child rising to the surface. "The contract was for 1 year, to stabilize the board, to secure the surgery. You have what you needed, Nate. Mia is safe. You have your dignity back. When this is over, you will walk away. And if I let myself feel this, the resulting collateral damage will destroy me." Nate stared at her. The absolute tragic absurdity of her calculation broke his heart. She had waged war against billionaires, but she was terrified of the simple act of being loved. He slid his hands from her shoulders up to her face, gently cupping her cheeks. He forced her to maintain eye contact. "Look at me," Nate demanded softly. Kate's breath hitched. "I am looking." "Strip the title away. Gat kong viek sang mot ben." Nate's voice was a deep, resonant hum, stripping away the final layers of her defense. "I didn't hack a server farm to fulfill a contract. I didn't hold your hand in that waiting room because of a strategic partnership. I did it because of you." Kate closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, tracking down over his thumb. "Say it again," Nate whispered fiercely, demanding the absolute truth. "Say what you were trying to hide behind the corporate synergy. Say it, Kate. Look at me when you say it." Kate opened her eyes. The terror was still there, but it was matched by an overwhelming, desperate courage. Love is not a transaction. It is a profound, terrifying surrender. "I love you," Kate gasped, the words tearing out of her chest like a physical object. The dam broke entirely. I love you. I love Mia. I don't want the Empire anymore, Nate. I want the burned toast. I want the purple dragons. I want to be her mother. I want to be your wife. Not on paper, in reality. I want a family. Nate didn't answer with words. He pulled her against him, crashing his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision of survival and absolute devotion. It was the sealing of a promise forged in the fires of hell and brought back into the light. Kate clung to the lapels of his suit, kissing him back with a desperate, starving intensity. The sterile hospital corridor vanished. The corporate threats dissolved. They were the only two people left in the universe, anchoring each other against the void. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Nate rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Kate Sinclair, Nate swore, his voice a steady, unbreakable vow. There is no exit strategy. There is no annulment. We are exactly where we are supposed to be. A nurse cleared her throat discreetly behind them. Mr. Wright, Miss Sinclair, she is settled in recovery. You can come in now. They did not walk into the recovery room as a maintenance man and a CEO. They walked through the doors as a family, their hands tightly locked together, ready to face the long, slow, beautiful process of healing. The next few weeks were a blur of gradual, profound transformation. Mia's recovery was a grueling, agonizingly slow battle. There were days of intense pain, setbacks with fluid drainage, and the terrifying, exhausting process of weaning her off the heavy narcotic pain management. But the heavy hug was gone. The harsh, rattling wheeze that had haunted Nate's nightmares was entirely absent. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, powerful rhythm, driven by a repaired heart that pumped oxygen-rich blood through her small body. Kate did not return to the Sinclair Global Tower. She took an immediate, indefinite leave of absence, citing family medical emergencies. She delegated the daily operations to Richard Caldwell and the Stabilizing Executive Committee. She spent her days sitting in the harsh hospital chair, reading storybooks, painting clumsy purple dragons, and learning the intricate, delicate art of mothering a fragile child. She learned the specific tone of Mia's cries. She learned exactly how to adjust the hospital bed to alleviate the pressure on the sternal incision. She learned how to braid Mia's dark curls with gentle, patient fingers. Nate watched the Ice Queen dissolve completely into a fiercely protective, deeply loving matriarch. He watched her sacrifice her sleep, her comfort, and her corporate dominance without a single second of hesitation. When Mia was finally discharged from the hospital, 32 days after the surgery, they did not return to the sterile penthouse in the sky. Kate had quietly instructed her real estate brokers to sell the Manhattan property. It was a fortress built for an isolated monarch, entirely unsuitable for a messy, loud, healing family. Instead, the black SUV drove them out of the city, crossing the bridge into the quiet, sprawling suburbs of Westchester County. They pulled up to a massive, sprawling colonial house, surrounded by ancient oak trees and a vast, rolling green lawn. The house was painted a warm, inviting white with dark blue shutters. It looked like a home built for Sunday dinners and muddy footprints. Mia, sitting in the back seat with a small heart-shaped pillow clutched against her healing chest, stared at the massive yard with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Is this the new castle?" Mia asked, her voice stronger, carrying the vibrant energy of a healthy child. "This is home, baby," Nate said, unbuckling his seatbelt. They walked up the wide brick pathway together. The crisp autumn air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Nate unlocked the heavy oak door. The interior was spacious, filled with warm sunlight streaming through large bay windows, hardwood floors waiting to be scuffed, and a massive kitchen explicitly designed for chaotic, messy breakfasts. The transition from survival to actual living was not instantaneous. It required patience. It required dismantling the residual trauma of the hospital. But they built their new reality piece by piece. Nate officially resigned from his position at Sinclair Global. He had proven his competence. He had dismantled his enemies. He did not need the corporate title to validate his self-worth. Instead, he launched a boutique data security consulting firm, operating out of the massive study on the ground floor of the new house. He built his own empire, on his own terms, setting his own hours to ensure he was never absent for the school run. Kate eventually returned to the CEO chair, but the board immediately recognized the profound shift in her leadership. The absolute terrifying ruthlessness was gone, replaced by a strategic, empathetic vision that prioritized sustainable growth over vicious quarterly acquisitions. She implemented a sweeping overhaul of the corporate charity fund, placing it under strict, transparent oversight, and massively expanded the employee healthcare benefits. The nights of sitting alone in the dark with a glass of scotch were entirely gone, replaced by the chaotic, wonderful noise of reading bedtime stories, fighting over homework, and the quiet, profound intimacy of falling asleep next to a man who saw past the armor to the soul beneath. 2 years later. The morning sun burned through the early autumn mist, casting a brilliant golden glow over the sprawling backyard of the Westchester estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming hydrangeas and freshly cut grass. The backyard had been transformed. Rows of simple, elegant white wooden chairs were arranged on the lawn, facing a magnificent archway woven with deep purple and white roses. A string quartet played a soft, classical melody from a small patio. The seats were filled with a strange, eclectic mix of people. Richard Caldwell and several members of the Sinclair executive board sat shoulder to shoulder with Nate's old neighbors from the cramped apartment building, the local pharmacist Mrs. Higgins and Dr. Eris Thorne. The rigid boundaries of class and wealth had been entirely obliterated by the shared celebration of a genuine miracle. Nate stood beneath the floral archway. He wore a sharp midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The deep, bruised exhaustion that had haunted his eyes 2 years ago was completely gone. He radiated a calm, profound strength. The strength of a man who had walked through hell, refused to surrender his dignity, and emerged carrying everything he loved. He watched the back doors of the colonial house open. A collective gasp rippled through the seated guests. Mia walked out onto the grass. She was 8 years old now. The pale, fragile ghost of the ICU was entirely a memory. She was a vibrant, unstoppable force of nature. She wore a beautiful, flowing purple dress that spun around her knees as she walked. Her dark curls bounced with every step. There was no wheeze. There was no hesitation. She moved with the chaotic, joyful energy of a perfectly healthy chut. She carried a small velvet pillow. Resting on the center of the pillow were 2 simple, elegant platinum bands. She walked down the grassy aisle, grinning at the guests, showing off a prominent, endearing gap where she had recently lost a front tooth. She reached the archway and stood proudly beside her father. "Did I walk too fast?" Mia whispered loudly. "You were perfect, baby." Nate smiled, gently touching her cheek. Then the music shifted. A slow, resonant cello melody swelled across the lawn. Kate stepped out of the house. She did not wear severe charcoal tailoring. She did not wear armor. She wore a breathtaking, simple white silk gown that draped perfectly across her figure. Her dark hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She carried a bouquet of purple orchids. She walked down the aisle alone. She did not need an escort. She was a woman who had conquered her own demons, surrendered her isolation, and walked willingly into the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of unconditional love. Nate watched her approach. His chest tightened, a massive, overwhelming wave of emotion threatening to break his composure. He remembered the cold, arrogant woman standing in the penthouse kitchen, offering him a check to disappear. He remembered the terrified woman weeping in the hospital corridor, begging for the right to be a mother. She reached the altar. She handed her bouquet to Mia. She turned and took Nate's hands. Her skin was warm. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears reflecting the golden morning light. You look beautiful, Nate whispered. I look happy, Kate corrected softly, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. The officiant, an older, kind-faced judge, stepped forward. This was not a quick, legally mandated signature in a dark bar. This was a deliberate, profound declaration before witnesses. They did not recite standard vows. They spoke the truth they had forged in the fire. I brought you into my life as a shield, Kate spoke first, her voice clear and carrying over the quiet lawn. I was terrified of the world, and I thought you could protect my fortress. But you didn't guard the walls, Nate. You tore them down. You demanded my humanity. You showed me that power is meaningless without purpose, and that true strength is found in the courage to surrender. You gave me a family. You gave me a home. You gave me my soul. Nate squeezed her hands, his thumb gently tracing the knuckles. I was a man drowning in the dark, Nate said, his deep voice thick with emotion, projecting the raw honesty that had saved them both. I thought my duty was simply to endure the pain. I thought doing the right thing meant suffering in silence. But you showed me that fighting for dignity doesn't mean fighting alone. You stood beside me in the darkest hour of my life. You loved a broken man and you loved a fragile child, and you healed us both with a fiercely protective heart I never saw coming. I choose you today, Kate, not as an escape, not as a contract, but as the absolute love of my life. Mia stepped forward, holding up the small velvet pillow. Nate picked up the smaller platinum band. He looked at Kate, his eyes locking onto hers with an unwavering, eternal promise. He slid the ring onto her finger. Kate picked up the larger band. Her hands were perfectly steady. She slid the ring onto Nate's finger, completing the circle. By the power vested in me, and by the undeniable truth of the love witnessed here today, the judge announced, a wide smile on his face, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Nate didn't hesitate. He pulled Kate into his arms, kissing her with the same desperate, starving intensity of the hospital corridor, but grounded now in the absolute security of their shared reality. The guests erupted into applause. Cheers echoed across the lawn. They broke the kiss, laughing, resting their foreheads together. Mia cheered the loudest, throwing her arms around both of their waists, burying her face in the white silk of Kate's dress and the dark wool of Nate's tuxedo. Nate looked down at his daughter, healthy and vibrant. He looked at his wife, radiant and completely open to the world. He looked out at the faces of the people celebrating their unlikely, brutal, beautiful journey. He realized the profound truth of the long, agonizing road they had traveled. The universe did not negotiate, but it occasionally allowed you to rewrite the ending if you refused to compromise your soul. Doing the right thing always exacts a toll, but the reward is eternal. Nate wrapped one arm tightly around his wife and the other around his daughter. He looked up at the clear, bright blue sky, the shadows of the past finally permanently banished by the light.